On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for our celebration of Black History Month. Our speaker today is Bernice Alexander Bennett, author of Black Homesteaders of the South. Bernice Alexander Bennett is an award-winning author, genealogist, nationally recognized guest speaker, storyteller, and producer-host of the podcast Research at the National Archives and Beyond. She is also the first recipient of the Ida B. Wells Service Award given by the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage for her dedication to broadcasting stories about enslaved and indentured ancestors of African descent. In addition, she received the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society's Elizabeth Clark Lewis Genealogy Award in 2019 for original research to support African American genealogy. Bennett is a former member of the Board of Directors for the National Genealogical Society, co-founder and faculty member of the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute, a volunteer with the Homestead National Historical Park Service, and former citizens archivist with the Civil War Digitization Project of the National Archives and Records Administration. Bennett, a New Orleans native and descendant of homesteader Peter Clark of Livingston Parish, is committed to encouraging other descendants to write and share their family stories.
Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Black Homesteaders of the South. My name is Bernice Alexander Bennett. So the Black Homesteaders of the South tell stories of resilience and celebrate individuals, some of whom were formerly enslaved but were able, after their emancipation, to obtain up to 160 acres of land under the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, the Homestead Act of 1862 was signed by President Abraham Lincoln, and it went into effect January 1st, 1863. Now, I feel it's important for you to understand what this act is all about, and so I'll go through what some of the qualifications are to obtain this land. The individual had to be over the age of 62, never take up arms against the United States, single women, widows, immigrants, and later former slaves could apply for this land. Now, the reason I'm saying later former slaves, because in 1862, we had a large number of enslaved individuals, and they were not considered citizens. So let me tell you about the acquisition process. Since we are looking at 160 acres of land, they first had to settle on the land, then file an application and pay a small filing fee. They had to cultivate, improve, and live on that land for a minimum of 5 years. Then they had to bring in witnesses. Now, these witnesses would go in and they would testify and basically state everything that the claimant said they did. They needed those witnesses. Also, they had to post information in the newspaper, file for a deed or title, and pay another small fee, and then they would get a land patent. Now, of course, if they didn't want to do this, they could pay up to, I think, about $1.25 an acre and purchase their 160 acres. But most people didn't have that kind of money. So let's look at this poster for a minute. This poster was put out by the National Homestead Historical Park site to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, this came out in 2012. Now, what you see on this poster is very interesting. Free land. I mean, millions of acres of land free. You also see the word American Dream. And under that, you see a family, a Black family in the middle of this poster. But when you think about the American Dream, let's think about what a formerly enslaved person thought of, or for that matter, everybody. Education, the right to vote. They wanted to work for wages and religious freedom and safety, and yes, land and home ownership. But before I get into a little bit more about land and home ownership, let me talk to you all about another act. And this act was called the Southern Homestead Act. It went into effect June 21st, 1866. And it opened up about 46 million acres of land and gave people an opportunity to apply for, let's say, about 80 acres of land each. Now, those states included Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Florida, and Alabama. Those were the southern states. Those were also the states that were part of the Confederacy. The individuals that were targeted for this particular land under that act were freed slaves, white who didn't have anything, people that were loyal to the United States. But there's a problem with this act. It was poorly administered. In fact, they didn't even have land offices. It was a lot of bureaucracy, and it was later repealed. But that didn't mean that the land was not still there. Now, we had several Reconstruction amendments that made it possible for formerly enslaved individuals to acquire the public land that I mentioned. You had the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. And so when you look at this map, this is a map of the public land states. And what you see here are states that are not brown. You see states that are a teal color. These were not public land states, and I'm always being asked, well, what about Georgia? What about South Carolina? No, these were not public land states. And Texas, no. But we had 30 public land states where individuals could apply for that public land. But let me just take you in another direction for a minute. Because when I talked about land ownership or land, we had following the Civil War was the whole sharecropping system. Now, after the abolition of slavery and the devastation of the Civil War, sharecropping enabled landowners to establish or reestablish their labor force while giving poor whites and free Black people a means of subsistence. About 2/3 of sharecroppers were white and 1/3 were Black. This system really severely restricted the economic mobility of the laborers, and it led to a lot of conflicts during the Reconstruction era. So let me just go to Louisiana. First of all, I want you all to understand that the Black Homesteaders of the South book consists of stories from Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi. But I'm going to focus only on the Louisiana homesteaders. Well, in total, there were 22,988 homesteads were approved up in Louisiana. That meant they met all of the criteria. They stayed on that land for 5 years, and they proved up. They did what they were supposed to do. Now, when you look at the amount of acreage, the homesteaded land was 2 million, basically over 2,500,000 acres of land, which is 9% of the land in the state. Now, in the Black Homesteaders of the South book, we have 18 Black homesteaders. And these homesteader stories are from 9 parishes: Ascension, Bossier, East Baton Rouge, East Feliciana, Livingston, St. Helena, Washington, West Feliciana, and Claiborne. And it's so exciting for me to really just tell you that we have these stories, because in the beginning, we didn't have any. And now we have 18 and more are coming. In fact, I have more that I need to write. So this was a newspaper article in the New Orleans Republican on October 3rd, 1871. It stated, "It appears from statistics at the Land Department that 19,000 settlers have made bona fide entries on public lands within the last year. Since the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862, there have been 100,000 entries. These alone make 20,000 more landholders than there are in Great Britain." So they're bragging. There are a lot of people out there trying to get that land. So let me take you on another little journey for a minute, because there's always a question, well, how did you get involved in this project? And yes, there is the Black Homesteaders Project, which is part of the Homestead National Historical Park in Nebraska. Now, stories have been written, but those stories have focused on the Great Plains. In fact, there is a center for the Great Plains out of the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And they have been studying the colonies, the Black colonies that were established. And those Black colonies were part of the Homestead Act. That was homestead land. And so stories definitely have been on the website from the Great Plains. However, there are 30 homestead states. And with 30 homestead states, there was an outreach effort to get others to write and share their stories. And that's how I got involved with the Homestead National Historical Park. I am a proud descendant of a Louisiana homesteader. So what did it take? Well, you had to have something. First of all, you had to have a little money, because you needed farm tools, you needed seeds, you needed livestock, you had to pay a small filing fee. You even needed transportation, because you needed to go from where you live to a land office to apply for this land. You also needed other resources and skills. You needed skills in agriculture. And I would say that most of the African Americans that applied for that land definitely had agriculture skills, animal husbandry, carpentry, blacksmith, and you could probably think of a lot more. They also needed some community support, and they needed witnesses, and there were other things that they needed. But I want you to think and recognize that that single person could not do this alone. They needed others to help them. So the goal for everyone was to obtain a land patent. Now, the land patent is a legal document that transferred ownership from the United States government to individuals. And this is what my great-great-grandfather's land patent looked like. Yes, Peter Clark received this land patent from the New Orleans Land Office, and he acquired 159.33 acres of land in Maurepas, Louisiana. So how do you even know that your ancestors own land? Well, some of you may already know because you used to visit the family farm. Others, somebody told them. I know I had oral history from my grandmother saying that her granddaddy owned a lot of land. But for those of you that don't know, but when you're looking at the census and you see that your ancestor was a farmer and that they owned their land, I want to tell everybody, check out the Bureau of Land Management. So this is what this site looks like. First of all, this is my ancestor, Peter Clark. I put his name in at the Bureau of Land Management, and his name came up, the land, 1896. This is the document number, which is his patent in Livingston Parish. So I know this is correct. And when you see information like this come up, you will see that he had to go to the land office in New Orleans. That is where he is. That's where most people in that part of Louisiana would go. I know that the authority was homestead land because it's stated here. And then these are two document numbers. And then there's the acreage, the 159.33 acres of land that he acquired. And this is what you will see on the Bureau of Land Management. You will actually see a pattern. And that pattern looks like this, although what I showed you of the first pattern, it was the original pattern. And that pattern is in the hands of a family member right now. But this pattern, Peter Clark's name is listed. They give the location of the land, the acreage. The president of the United States was Grover Cleveland at that time. And this is the date. And this is my great-great-grandfather, Peter Clark, with his son, Moses. Now, if you have found a land pattern, and this is what's so important for all of you to understand, if you have found a land pattern, you are at the end of the process. That means that your ancestor lived on that land for 5 or more years, some 10 years, some even 12 years. The point is there is a case file that you can find more information on. The case files are located at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And you can see this, land entry files, Louisiana. Yes, all of these boxes are from Louisiana, or for Louisiana homesteaders. And if you just look at a box, look at how many records, that's probably about 50 records in there. Those stories that are in the boxes are stories that you will not get from anywhere else. So I am talking about Black homesteaders with primary sources, writing the stories, telling us basically what did they do to get that land. And that's what the Black homesteaders of the South book is about. So what can you find in the land entry case files? Of course, the settler's name, where she was born, the age, when they settled on the land, where the land is located, how much money they paid, the filing fee, what kind of improvements did they make, well, how many individuals lived in the home, did they sign with an X or their signature, who were the witnesses, when did they obtain the land, and what is the patent number and the number of acres. So much information, how would you know it? You wouldn't get all of this just by looking at the patent. You actually have to go to the case files. And I just love going through the case files. You also have to understand that these people, when I talked about money, they needed to travel to the land offices. Now, this is a land office that's still in existence. It's really a historical site in Greensburg, Louisiana, in St. Helena Parish. And we have one story in the book where they actually ended up filing their final papers in Greensburg because they couldn't get back to New Orleans. Some of the other land offices were located in New Orleans, East Baton Rouge, and Natchitoches. And this is just information, something in the newspaper from the Natchitoches, the land office in Natchitoches. And it was a whole newspaper full of homestead entries. And I love going through the newspapers because it's just amazing, all of the homestead entries that you will find. And I'm saying that because when I talk to people and I talk about the Homestead Act of 1862, a lot of them are not aware of the fact that this information was out there and it was public. So let me just take you through the process, because this is what you will see when you go into a land entry case file. So this is a case file for a gentleman named Moses Singleton. Well, I told you you will find out the age. Well, Moses Singleton is 67 years old, and his post office address is Blairstown, Louisiana, not as East Feliciana Parish. He applied on the 10th of October 1900. He was born in Louisiana, and he built his house in 1901. He built a log dwelling, a cotton house. He cleared and fenced 15 acres for 6 seasons, and he valued that at $300. When it came to him describing his land, he said, oh, it was ordinary pine land, most valuable for farming. How would you know that unless you saw it in his land entry case file? Well, he had to also name witnesses. And this is the information he provided, the names of his witnesses. He signed his name, not with his signature, but with an X. Remember I mentioned that? He also had to put down some money, but we'll talk about that later. But in the land office was Walter L. Cohen. And this is a picture of Walter L. Cohen. He was a Black Republican in New Orleans, and he was appointed as the Register of the Land Office by Theodore Roosevelt. So I mentioned the newspaper. Well, we even know what paper it was in because that was in the file. The Southern Watchman newspaper of Clinton, Louisiana. Now, again, you would not know this unless you had these case files to read this, because here we are, we're dealing with primary sources. And he named one of his witnesses, and his witness came on with his testimony, basically supporting everything that Moses Singleton said. And his witness was John Turner, and John was 36 years old. I also know that John Turner also became a homesteader. And this is one of the things you will find when you start studying the witnesses. You follow them, and you also find that they are also homesteaders. And John Turner's family and Moses Singleton's family right now are living near each other to this day. I know that because I just talked to them recently. I mentioned a filing fee, where here Moses Singleton had to pay $14. That was his filing fee to get this information recorded. And when I shared with you the Homestead National Historical Park site and the fact that they wanted stories, this is what the story looked like on the Homestead National Historical Park website. And this is similar to what the story looks like in the book. So let me take you to another homestead. It's very interesting about Laban Brock, because I was on the phone talking to the descendant. And as we began to talk about another family line, I said to her, do you know if your family members own land? And she said, yes, Laban Brock. So as I was talking to her, of course, I looked it up on the Bureau of Land Management. And yes, indeed, she was correct. He owned land. And I ordered his land entry case file. Well, Laban Brock was 26 years old, and he was a farmer and self-employed. He resided in Dillon, Mississippi, and he applied for his land on September the 22nd, 1884. And he lived with a man named William Brock in Mississippi. He also stated that he was a native-born citizen of the United States. So Laban is now describing when he first resided and made improvements. Now, he put in his application in 1884, but as you can see, he did not reside until 1885. And he built a dwelling house, a smokehouse. He bought crib and stables. He cleared and fenced 6 acres of land, and he valued his improvements at $150. So who were his witnesses? And you see them: Josiah Broomfield Willis, Jordan Lee, and Green Andrews. And this is the part of when I go to a file, I love seeing information about the witnesses, because that's telling you even more about your ancestors and who provided that community support. So I always tell people, follow the witnesses. So this is the story that was written on Labram Brock. And it's slightly different in the book, but one point I want to share with you is that there's a statement here. He soon moved out of his family home. Brock indicated in his homestead application that he lived with William Brock in Mississippi before making his claim. This may have been William Brock, a white man living in Pike County, Mississippi at the time. It is likely that William Brock was related to or was himself the enslaver of Laban's family. Moving on, another story. And this is Thomas Pittman out of Washington Parish. And as you'll notice, I'm giving you different parishes because I want you to see just how, there's so many more stories here. But there's something interesting about Thomas Pittman. Thomas Pittman filed on July 12, 1899. But he then decided to cancel his application in 1903 through what they call a relinquishment file. And he did this in the New Orleans office. Then on October the 9th of that same year, he decided to go back and ask to have it reinstated. Now, the reason he stated he wanted to step away from his original claim was that as a colored man, he alleges that acting on the advice of his family and friends, he relinquished his entry for the reason of threats of contests by certain white citizens. Now, this is written in his file. We would never have known this. The only thing you would have known is that he got his land, but you did not know that he was threatened. And he decided he was not going to allow this to stop him from getting his land. So his entry was reinstated. Another story. And this story is about Josiah Cyprian. Now, I don't know if I mentioned to you or not that some of the homesteaders were former members of the United States Colored Troops. And I spent a lot of time reviewing the invalid pension files. Well, this was a file for Josiah Cyprian. And I decided, why not give more background on him? Because here it is in writing, right there, that around the age of 18 or 20, Josiah enlisted on August 17, 1864, and it names the Company G. And also he said more about where he was born, you know, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I have to put this in this story. And I did. I put that he was born on the Henry Cooper Plantation on the Chifuncta River, about 15 miles near Madison and St. Tammany Parish. And he was born in 1840, but he became a homesteader, folks. I just love these stories. I get so excited about it. So let me take you to another homesteader. This time we're in Bossier Parish. So I've covered now several parishes. So now we're in Bossier Parish. and George Paysinger is out of plain dealing. You can see the desk. This is the desk, a federal style desk that George Paysinger crafted. And this is what his papers look like in the newspaper. But what I wanted to share with you was when he passed away. And this was in the Bossier Banner. I mean, George Paysinger is very well known, and there are a lot of stories about him. But this one kind of struck me differently. I looked at it and it said, you know, another good Negro, one of the old time darkies, and this was the language of that time, Uncle George Paysinger, that he died near Roberta on the 9th, age, he's 86 years old. Uncle George was born in Houston County, Georgia, and was brought to Louisiana as the property of Hamilton and Hodges by Gideon Allen during 1845. As a slave, he was humble and industrious. As a freedman, intelligent and upright. Well, when I looked at the first landowners, and this is from a site called History Geo, I could see that George Paysinger, and his name is on here, these are his plots. George Paysinger was living near Hamilton and some of his witnesses. And the land is still in the family today. Now, I mentioned women, single women could apply for this land. And Phoebe Ann Bartlett Franklin is one of those women. And she was formerly enslaved, we know that, but she also applied for and received 42.23 acres of land. See, she was born enslaved in 1835 on the Waterloo Plantation. The land that she acquired is near the Waterloo Plantation. And her granddaughter, her great-great-granddaughter, sent me this note saying, I'm so proud of my great-great-grandmother, Phoebe Franklin, and her industrious and steadfast attitude that has been handed down through the generations to the daughters of her maternal line. A formerly enslaved woman did not allow anything to hinder her from pursuing an opportunity that could benefit her and her offspring for years to come. I can imagine just how proud Kimberly is today. This is another story, which is very interesting, because I did not know at the time that Charles Baptiste was a homesteader. This is one of the stories that I wrote. And Charles Baptiste was in the family Bible. I also discovered that Charles Baptiste was a witness for my grandmother when she got married in 1913, and also a witness for Peter Clark. And this was so interesting to me because I turned to my mother and I said, do you know who Charles Baptiste is? And she said, yes, he's a family friend of my grandmother, which meant her grandmother, who was born in 1879. And I'm just moving really quickly because I'm almost to the end of this, but this is just another story, another application. This man, Germasino Vidal, was a cigar maker, and he acquired his land in Maurepas, Louisiana. He stated in his application he had a wife and one adopted child. And he goes on to talk about when he built his home. Now, his witnesses are also listed, but what's interesting about his witnesses and what really made me stop and look and study his file was that this man, Benjamin Frazier, was also a member of the United States Colored Troop, and Henry Tinkshell was a witness for my great-great-grandfather when he applied for his land. So I'm looking at all of these family connections here. And Benjamin, if I didn't say it already, Benjamin Frazier was also a witness for my grandmother. His name is on her marriage application. So to conclude, I would like to say, and I want everyone to understand, there is a Facebook group called the Descendants of African American Homesteaders. Now, it certainly doesn't just consist of descendants from Louisiana. We have descendants from all the southern states, plus Michigan, plus Nebraska, as well as Oklahoma, and more stories are coming. And so I would encourage individuals that are interested in studying homesteaders to join this page. We are supportive of each other, but more importantly, we believe in getting primary resources and telling the story. So this is a website for you all to seek out to find out more about the stories that are being written and submitted to the Homestead National Historical Park. And I know I've already been asked, will there be a part 2 Black Homesteaders book? Well, it depends on all the new stories that come in. And I certainly look forward to having more stories come in. So these are the contributors. All of these people are Louisiana contributors. And you can imagine how exciting everyone was when they received their book, The Black Homesteaders of the South. So to conclude, follow the footsteps of your ancestors. Yes, they have footsteps in the land entry case files. Thank you so very much. And this concludes my presentation.